We are live now on Facebook. Thank you as always for joining us. This is our Thursday Roots Action No Honeymoon Call series. Tonight we are joined by author James Bradley and activist Hyun Lee. And we're going to have an amazing call today about building peace in China or with China and North Korea and the Western Pacific generally. Before we get into our conversation, like I always like to do, introduce what these calls are all about. First and foremost, these calls are educational. We want people here and who are streaming online to learn something. We want these calls to be engaging. So if you have questions, please ask them because we want to help you answer your questions. And we want to help you take action in the simplest, easiest, least scary way possible so that you can engage with your representatives. So that's the goal of this. We welcome feedback. Let me know how we're doing and ways we can improve. We are live streaming right now on Facebook. In the next couple of days, this will get uploaded to YouTube, so watch out for it there. And I will also send it to James, who will put this up as a podcast. So looking forward to that. Quick updates on our No Honeymoon campaign. Next week will mark the 100 days of Biden's presidency. And so we're going to be talking with Jeff Cohen, who is a Roots Action co-founder, and Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies. And we're going to be reviewing his first 100 days, domestic policy, foreign policy. How has he done? Yeah, that's going to be interesting. We'll see how that goes. If you haven't joined the team yet, nohoneymoon.org, rootsaction.org, join our team. You'll get emails from me about events like these. We're also going to be getting into some ProAct text banking next week, so be on the lookout for an email from me about that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guests. I'm going to talk to you both at the same time throughout this, so feel free to interject and add to each other's answers and whatnot. James, I know you're an expert on the area, the region more so. He says no. Okay, so first off, we have Hyun Lee. She is the U.S. national organizer for the 2020 Women-Led Korea Peace Treaty Campaign for Women Cross DMZ. She is a writer for ZoominKorea and an online resource for critical news and analysis on peace and democracy in Korea. She is an anti-war activist and organizer who has traveled to both North and South Korea. She's a Korea Policy Institute associate and routinely speaks at conferences, on webinars, and at public seminars. Thank you so much for being here, Hyun. We also have James Bradley, who is an American author and New York Times bestseller, specializing in historic nonfiction chronicling the Pacific theater of World War II. He is the author of Flags of Our Fathers, which is an excellent movie and was directed by Clint Eastwood, as well as books like The China Mirage, which is super interesting for tonight's conversation, The Imperial Cruise, and Flyboys, A True Story of Courage, also very interesting for tonight's conversation. We also have Madison Tang on the call. She's the coordinator for the China is Not Our Enemy campaign for Code Pink. Madison, feel free to engage in the chat. If people have questions, answer, talk, and we're gonna hear about Code Pink's campaign called China is Not Our Enemy at the end of our discussion with James and Hyun. So I guess to start, my most pressing question right now, and this is kind of greedy, is for Hyun. What is North Korea like? What is that like there? And I guess, what do they feel about the United States?
Wow, I was not expecting that question.
I'm sorry.
There's so much to say, but I'll keep it brief. I was there in 2011 for 2 weeks, so it was a very, very short trip. I'll just say that everything that the preconceived notions that I had about the country based on outside media reports, because that's the only source of information we have about the place, it just got completely turned upside down. I realized that there's so much I don't know about the place. Everything that I had assumed about the place was wrong. This was in 2011, so this is when we were still getting reports of, the country is about to collapse because people are starving. And I really expected to see like starving, emaciated children on the street. That was not the case. What I saw was a vibrant place that had gone through severe economic hardship, but one that was actually making a recovery. sort of a dramatic and almost miraculous recovery, given all of the decades of sanctions that they had struggled under. People were very proud. And surprisingly, at least the people that I was able to come in contact with, which was limited, because, you know, mainly it was people who were hotel staff or our guide or our van driver. So people who were sort of, you know, employed by the government specifically to host us. But, you know, surprisingly, they were very informed about the outside world and news about the United States. And, you know, I had a great conversation with my guide about the movie about Harvey Milk, you know, because she was very curious about, you know, the openness of people with different sexual orientation in the United States and the LGBT movement. And, you know, I asked her, what do you, you know, she had seen the movie. And so I said, what do you think about Harvey Milk? And she said, he was a great revolutionary. I admire him very much. So, you know, very surprising conversations that I never thought that I would have there. And, you know, it's unfortunate that we have a travel ban right now. So US citizens cannot travel to North Korea. That is actually one of our campaigns, is to lift the travel ban, because many people who were once able to travel there to reunite with family members and engage in people-to-people exchanges. All of that has been cut off since the 2017 travel ban imposed by the Trump administration. But once that's lifted, if our campaign is successful and we lift the ban, I encourage everybody to go there and see for themselves what the place is like.
That's so interesting. And I feel like it's, you know, the context that we have in America is very much that what we're fed by our own media and government apparatus. So I guess question for both of you, the context of the Western Pacific, of the US's relationship with both the Koreas and China. I guess we'll go to you, James. Could you give us a brief kind of understanding of the US's position and their relationships with countries in the Western Pacific and what that looks like? I know it's a big subject, but if you could, you know, fit that all in a box for us.
When the American colonists were colonists, when George Washington was a colonist before America was America, Britain was making a lot of money on China. So London said to the colonists, you can't trade directly with China. The Boston Tea Party was about a Chinese product with London tax on it. And then as soon as America became America, America jumped across the Pacific to try to trade with the richest group of, you know, bunch of money in the world out there in China. Warren Delano, the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the American opium king of China. And where am I here? So I'm doing the Pacific. Oh, and then we wanted to get closer to China. So Teddy Roosevelt had the idea, you know, we need a sluice. We need transport from China across the Pacific. So we'll build up this Navy, and then, oh, the Spanish Empire is weak. So we can grab the Philippines and Guam, and then we stole Hawaii, and we can cut a canal and get these other Spanish possessions, Puerto Rico and Cuba. And then we've got a sluice to China. You know, there was that strategy. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt spent more money on Chiang Kai-shek than he did the atom bomb to create Christianity in China, according to the Henry Luce of Time magazine and Pearl Buck of the Good Earth imagery. So there's been a big blank screen and not a lot of understanding between China and America. How's that for 2 minutes start?
That's pretty good. So the US, I guess I didn't know how, pretty much had an imperialist relationship with China from the beginning. Is that kind of?
Well, civilization was moving west, and the British, you know, were going to be in India forever, right? And the Germans were going to be in Namibia forever. And so that's just the way it was. And China was going to dissolve. Theodore Roosevelt believed that China was like an old barn that was going to fall in. So, you know, and it was true. There was a British part of China, the century of humiliation. That's what they're talking about. There was a German part of China, an American part of China, you know. It's a lot of history shove into a Zoom call, but I hope I answered your question.
No, that's all really good. And we're going to connect these relationships. I want to go to Hyun for a little historical context on the Koreas. I feel like in America, we pretty much, we don't really learn anything about the Korean War, to be honest. You know, I think we all know that. So what is the context there? And then we'll get into how China and Korea, their relationship. So the context of the U.S. relationship with the Koreas. Could you give us a brief breakdown of that?
Yeah, before I do that, I'll just piggyback on what James just talked about. You know, if we look back at the history of U.S. presence in Asia, the U.S. has long sought to write the rules of governance in Asia. So it literally wrote Japan's constitution after World War II. It created the Philippines form of governance. It installed a puppet government in South Korea in 1948. And if you read Kurt Campbell's book, you know, our Indo-Pacific policy coordinator, he wrote a book called The Pivot. And he, you know, according to him, US goals in Asia has always been three things. One, selling shirts. Two, saving souls. Three, spreading liberal values. And all of this has been done mostly by diplomats and missionaries, but always backed by military might. And also let's remember that throughout this history, after World War II and throughout the Cold War, US support for authoritarian rule in Asia, like Chun Doo-hwan in South Korea, Marcos in the Philippines, it was not an aberration. It was central to US pursuit of its strategic interests. And then after the Cold War, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the US became an unbridled global power, you know, and its attention was turned elsewhere, right? It was briefly engaged in the Eastern Europe and then for 2 decades in the Middle East. So while the US attention was turned elsewhere, China was very, very busy becoming a regional power of its own. It launched the Belt and Road Initiative, you know, building a navy that's strong enough to deter the US so that they can control the sea lanes. So, you know, all of this is, I think, what in a nutshell, what brings us to today, which is where the US sees China's rise as a direct threat to what was once its position as an unrivaled power in the world. And, you know, the pivot to Asia, which is, you know, the US current policy in Asia, is a continuation of this tradition that where the US is positioning itself, as opposed to China, to write the rules that will govern political and economic affairs in the region, because whoever writes the rules comes out on top. And the Biden team insists that, you know, its policy will be cooperation and competition with China. But, you know, when they say cooperation, what they really mean is cooperation on US terms, based on US rules, right? And the last thing I'll just say is that this kind of competition between the great powers, so-called, affects the entire region. And of particular concern to me is that as the US, you know, antagonism towards China, you know, it increases China's defense spending. And then what that does in turn is that increases defense spending by all the countries in the region, because the region is a very complex web of competing interests that are always in competition. So, you know, for example, the US provokes China. China increases its arms buildup. That provokes Japan to do that. And then if Japan is, you know, engaged in military buildup, South Korea says, wait a minute, we need to increase our defense spending. So, you know, this triggers an escalating arms race in the entire region. And as we're seeing domestically in the United States, increased arms buildup means increased risk of violence, right? I mean, that's one major contributing factor to all the mass shootings that we're seeing. And innocent people live in fear in the crosshair of China and the United States. And there is always the real threat of accidental skirmishes leading to a full-scale war. And I think the two places where that could likely happen are Korea or Taiwan.
So
Gotcha.
amen, amen. And can I add this, that Ms. Lee said, you know, what was the concern? And what she just said, she said, what is America's concern? It's that they're number one and they're going to be pushed to be number two by China and whatever. I mean, what are we talking about? This is history. You know, these are tectonic plates. This is like standing in the way of the movement of mountains, number one. Number two, what's wrong with being number two? China's going to be so, I mean, if there's 1.4 billion people in China, why, and there's only 350 million in the United States, why wouldn't it be logical that country could have a larger economy? And so what? Well, how does it threaten me? I could be a salesperson and think of the needs of my client and have a great relationship with China and make a fortune and make an absolute fortune. America could double its GNP. You know, this is not a win-lose situation, but it's presented in the media as that way. Oh my God, the Uyghurs in the cotton fields, and what am I going to do? It's a moral thing. No, it's tectonic historical movements, and we should calm down and have more fun with it.
Well, that, I mean, what you're talking about with comparing the countries is interesting to me. And what Hyun said about the US having a relationship with US rules and US terms reminds me a little bit of your idea of the China Mirage, and how historically, I hope I get this right, historically, we've always seen China as they'll become just like us or something like that, where really China does what China does, and they have their own unique culture and their own way of measuring success, where we're looking at everything in terms of the American perspective. Can you comment a little bit on what the China Mirage is and what it means today?
The China Mirage is just, it's nobody's fault. It's just historical. Look at Hyun. Where's Hyun from? She's from Korea. In George Washington's time, we didn't see a lot of Koreans walking around Washington, New York, and Philadelphia. We're a European country on the Atlantic, and China's across the biggest physical feature. So there was a big divide between the history of the United States and China. Then we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. If I was an American in the 20th century, for most of it, I couldn't know a Chinese because they couldn't get in, you know? So right. we haven't had contact. So just think, as we scrape the Chinese off the Western plate of America, think of it as a big black screen. So instead of really knowing Chinese, not many Americans have ever been to China to this day, you know, relatively compared to the ones who've been to school at the Sorbonne or at Oxford or whatever. So there's this big blank screen, and various powers have been able to project imagery on the big blank screen. Pearl Buck and Henry Luce projected 30 years of Chiang Kai-shek is going to have trickle-down democracy to China, and let's spend more money than the atom bomb on this idea. You know, it's fantasy. So right now we're fantasizing, you know, hey, I can imagine I work in the State Department, you know, hey, Joe or Ryan, you know, Americans are guilty about the slaves in the cotton fields. Why don't we make up this Uyghurs in the cotton fields thing, and Americans will believe it, just like WMD, you know, just like the Tonkin Gulf. I mean, you know, the great Norman Solomon went to the Washington Post many years later and said, did you ever retract the Tonkin Gulf story? And they said, if we retracted that story, which was not true, we'd have to retract about 11, 12 years of reporting of the Vietnam War.
Wow. And Norman Solomon is on this call right now, so good shout out there. Very interesting. Hyun, back to you. Talking about a unified Korea, which I think is something that a lot of activists are pushing for, and it's the goal of so many people. How does the US presence affect that possibility? And is that ultimately the goal of the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, I mean, every Korean person you talk to across the political spectrum, I think they will agree that we need to unify Korea. But if you ask what kind of unification, I think you'll get all sorts of different answers. So for example, at the end of the Korean War in 1953, South Korean strongman Syngman Rhee did not sign the armistice. He was dead set against it because what he wanted was to keep fighting to unify Korea by force, right? Both North and South Korea, they have military operation plans to unify the country by force in the event of war, right? And in that case, civil society has no say in determining the future of the country. During wartime, military generals and often foreign powers on the side of the victor are the ones who get to decide, and the people have no say in wartime. And we've seen that time and time again, right? So in order for civil society, the people of Korea to have a voice, we need peaceful unification, right? And the two Koreas have actually discussed a plan for this. So in 2000, South Korean leader Kim Dae-jung and North Korean leader Kim Jong-il, they agreed on a vision for peaceful unification. It was called the June 15 Declaration, after the date when they met. And it had some really good points in this declaration. One is that unification should be done independently, meaning without foreign intervention. It should be pan-Korean, a bottom-up process that involves Koreans in the North, South, and overseas. And it should begin with people-to-people meetings and economic cooperation. So they should respect the two, there should be one country, but two systems for some indefinite time. And the task of political unification may be the task of future generations after there's been ample period of reconciliation and cooperation. So, after that meeting from 2000 to 2007, there was a period of time when there were lots of people-to-people exchanges between North and South and overseas. There was the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which was a complex for economic cooperation. And this is the vision that many progressives still hold on to, and also now I noticed there's more discussion about a unified Korea that is non-aligned, that finally ends Cold War divisions in the region. And this is all the more urgent now because of the US-China competition. And Korea is caught right in the crosshairs of that. Also, people are talking about a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region that is free from threats of nuclear weapons. So our vision is a non-aligned, unified Korea. So it's not aligned with US or China, unified Korea that is part of a multilateral cooperation in the region for peace. And to get there, the first step has to be a peace agreement that ends the current unresolved Korean War and allows all parties to draw down their arms. And the US government, frankly, has been the main obstacle to that goal.
Super interesting. I'm glad I was going to ask you, what do you mean by not aligned? But that makes perfect sense. Just not aligning with the world powers that are trying to pull the strings anyways. I imagine China has a reaction to that, though. We'll go to James real quick. James, China and North Korea, do you have context on that relationship and what it's like? And do you think, is China also trying to control the North Korea and thus the Korean Peninsula and drive up American arms spending? Like, what is the Chinese perspective there on the Korean Peninsula?
Let me give you maybe the old Chinese perspective. You know what I mean? I'm in New Zealand and I'm an American, so I'll just make it up.
Right.
But,
no, I know you. Yeah, I hear you.
But, Taiwan was part of China. Korea wasn't. Korea is an ancient friend of China that lived underneath the arm of China a bit. Japan was not invading China. A lot of things weren't happening. And then all of a sudden, a guy named Commodore Perry sailed out with a huge flotilla of arms, and we opened up the Pacific. Commodore Perry was the guy that invaded Mexico. It was the largest amphibious invasion until World War II, right? And then they send him to Japan. And these cue balls start to move. And there's all these little questions about North Korea and South Korea. I mean, a lot of history here. But if we go back, Beijing might look at it, take a 2,000-year view and say, just calm down. Asia can figure this out. We know the history of Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula. I'm sure the Koreans can work it out together somehow. We're okay. We don't need bases all over the place surrounding us. We don't need all these armaments into Asia for Asia to be Asia. We just don't need it. And America, you're going broke. Your dollar. There's a lot of pressure. You could just withdraw those tens and tens of thousands of guys that are sitting here trying to influence Asia, and you could save a lot of money. How about that?
Yeah, I hear you there. Do you think the United States, this is a question for both of you. We'll start with James real quick. The United States military budget constantly increasing, our military presence, how detrimental is that to relationships in the Western Pacific and building peace there?
I didn't, when did I start paying taxes? I guess I had a job when I was 9 years old or 16 or something, but I didn't realize until I got to be older that I spent half my life paying into a system where about 50% goes to armaments, and that I'm surrounded by war colleges of all types.
Right.
And that every large civic meeting in the United States that takes place, the military comes out with the colors. I didn't realize that. So I guess if you surround the country with war colleges and you take 50% of the taxes and invest in war, we need some war, and the Army's got Russia and the Navy's got China, and let's go. Right.
I mean, yeah, it definitely makes the American military industrial complex want war. If all you have is hammers, everything looks like a nail. I think it's
but I don't blame the guys in the military. I blame me. I paid those taxes. I see this guy. I paid those taxes. I paid for that system, and I stayed in it. Not, I mean, it's the people on this call, and it's the people at Walmart or where everyone's going to shop today. We're the ones doing it. It's not Mr. Military. We're voting for this. We are saying, we are projecting missiles and then saying, I got to watch the game. I mean, it's us that should take the responsibility to calm this situation down instead of poking a bear in Europe. And are you reading about the war game scenarios? They're just getting more disastrous for the United States. China would, win in an hour, then they'll win in 45 minutes. And then we don't need this, Asia can work it out.
Right. And I think that's what, people like the people on this call are trying to do everything we can to prevent this. Hyun, to you, military bases and American military spending, I imagine that has a huge effect on the Korean Peninsula. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll tell you one more story of a girl that I met when I was on that trip to North Korea in 2011. We went to a cooperative farm outside of Pyongyang, and we met with a lot of young women who were like 17, 16 years old. And one of them told me this story that sort of like stopped me in my tracks. She said, everybody in the country, including young girls, they're trained in self-defense, which, I mean, of course is a good thing. Everybody should be trained in self-defense. And then everybody also has a grab bag, a personal grab bag, in case a war breaks out or there's an aerial bombardment, something that you grab and go. It just sort of made me stop to think, like, this is a country where everybody for 70 years has lived with this mindset, right? That war can break out at any moment. Every time the US and South Korea conduct large-scale military exercises, which is very often, the entire country of North Korea goes into emergency mode because the exercises, they used to mobilize tens of thousands of troops, nuclear bombers, aircraft carriers, and from their vantage point, they always had to be prepared for the possibility that that could be a prelude to a real invasion. And these exercises, they happen every year, multiple times a year. The main ones being the springtime exercises that usually occur in March, and they used to be called Key Resolve Full Eagle, and the summer exercises, usually in late August, called Ulchi Freedom Guardian. They're based on military operation plans that include very provocative things like preemptive strikes and special operation units that are trained to infiltrate and decapitate North Korea's leadership. So they go beyond the defense of South Korea from a potential North Korean attack, which is what they used to be. Now they include plans for invading, occupying, counterinsurgency measures. These are all offensive. And then not only that, they're also very costly. So, there aren't figures available for exactly how much these exercises cost, but just one example is that it costs $130,000 to fly a B-2 bomber for 1 hour, which the US routinely used to do, as part of these exercises. And today is Earth Day, so I will also just, end by mentioning that the US military is one of the greatest polluters around the world. I'll end with one last story, which is I was in South Korea in 2008, I believe. And I was at a small village outside of a place called Pyeongtaek, where Camp Humphreys is based, and that is now the largest US overseas military base. And there were these farmers who were having nightly protest vigils to protest US plans for expanding its base and displacing all of the farmers off of their land. And I met one of the farmers, and he told me the story that there used to be a place that everybody referred to it as Oil Bridge, because there's this small footbridge outside of the wall of the base where there's just like constant gasoline that's leaking out of the base, right? And people used to just go there with buckets and just like take this, oil home to use as kerosene at home. And so, because these bases are walled off, nobody knows what happens inside the bases, but they could see that there's like constant land and water contamination. This is a big problem, obviously, around bases all around the world. And, our organization, we partnered with Veterans for Peace and About Face this past March to call for a suspension of these exercises to preserve room for peace talks with North Korea. And, US and South Korea, they moved ahead with the exercises, albeit they scaled it down mainly because of the pandemic. But they're scheduled to hold them again this August and then March of next year. And so we will continue to partner with Vets for Peace and About Face to call for the end of these exercises.
And those are great organizations. Good to hear you're partnering with them. Quick follow-up there, and maybe this is a simple answer probably, is how do we expect peace? How can we even pretend as a country, the United States is trying to build peace? Or how can we expect North Korea to disarm, to denuclearize, to come to the table if we're constantly doing these threats, these military exercises that are offensive military exercises, and we're constantly upping the amount of money we're spending on military and putting more bases up? Does that just destroy the chances that North Korea will actually come to the table and try to create peace? Is that the major hindrance?
Yeah, exactly. And also, not only that, the US is the greatest nuclear power in the world, and we're spending more money to modernize our nuclear forces, right? And so unless the greatest nuclear powers start to draw down their weapons, how can we call on countries like North Korea and other places that are directly under the gun of the US? How can we call on them to denuclearize?
Right. And for our action, as part of our calling portion of our action, we will be referencing the ICBM spending because it is insane, billions and billions of dollars. I think ROKANA, I believe it's a ROKANA bill as well. The ICBM Act, which would redirect those funds to vaccine development and things like that. Which we haven't even gotten into sanctions and how it affects COVID and how that affects North Korea, but we've talked about that previously on a different call. James, back to you for a final big question, and this will go to both of you. How can the US improve their relations with China? How can we create a lasting peace there so that we're not always spending all this money on military and scaring people into thinking there's war, or trying to trick people into supporting a potential war? What can the US do as a country?
I think as a person, you got to look at yourself, and it's an inside job. What's going on in America? If I walk around Shanghai at 10 p.m., I have no concern about my personal safety. How about San Francisco and New York? Are the people living in tents increasingly? I wonder how many increased today in America. Are they free? Are they free? Is that system of government that we were taught in first grade? How's that working right now? I mean, I hear from Blinken and the diplomats that China has to change its behavior. Why would China change its behavior? What does it help, like 800 million people?
Yeah.
Move up the ladder and have better nutrition and have better healthcare and have better education. And, you know, China's feeling pretty good. And China didn't fly around the world and invade Argentina. You know, China isn't dumping nuclear waste into the Pacific to poison it. That's going to poison down here to New Zealand. So your question is, how can America get along? John Mersheimer, the great political science, wrote a book, Why Leaders Lie. And he was surprised to find they don't lie to each other, because the president and the Russian president and the Chinese, they all see the same intelligence, so they don't lie to each other. He said the lying goes down, that leaders know they can lie to their own people because the people want to believe. And then there's a big blank screen about Asia and China, and they're putting baloney up there. Folks, these are the same people that, you know, told us about WMDs, Tonkin Gulf, Missile Gap. Now it's, we've got to save democracy in Taiwan, and democracy has left Hong Kong. It just fell off the side of the earth and everybody drowned, and there's slaves in the cotton fields of Xinjiang. I mean, why doesn't America just, what's right next to Xinjiang? It's Afghanistan. Where's the coverage of what America's doing in Afghanistan? Why are we worried about propaganda about Xinjiang? So I think America get its act together by looking at America, helping America. What would help America? More troops into Asia and the Ukraine? More conflict on East and West? Or maybe bringing the boys home?
Right, right. Yeah, no, I hear you on all that. That's really good. And that's interesting. A couple weeks ago, I talked to a professor of Russian politics and international politics, Andrei Saigenkov. And he said the exact same thing. The best thing America can do to build peace with Russia is to worry about America, to focus on our own problems, to improve everything here was what he suggested. Just stay away and fix America. So that's really interesting. Hyun, very similar question to you. Big picture, what can the US do to improve relations in the Western Pacific generally, but the Korean Peninsula more specifically?
Sure. You know, I agree with James's earlier point that we are in a very turbulent time when we're actually witnessing a tectonic shift, basically moving from a unipolar world where the US was an unrivaled superpower to a bipolar or maybe even a multipolar world. And I think there will be intense competition for who comes out on top to make the world in their image. But ultimately, I think we need to remember that it will be a competition between the ruling elites of those countries, and the ordinary people of the world, of both countries, will be squeezed no matter who comes out on top. So I think for progressives in the US, it means a few things. One, we need to be real clear about what is and isn't in the best interest of the people. You know, wars abroad may benefit weapons manufacturers, but not us. Free trade agreements, they might benefit Monsanto, not us, you know. So that's one. I think we also need to counter nativism in our communities, because, you know, as we've seen in history, as great powers are in competition, there will be increased nationalism. But the ordinary people of both countries, you know, we may have more in common with each other than the ruling elites of our countries, right? Yeah. And I agree with James, like, especially in the US, we need to be okay with not being number one all the time. You know, there are certain sections of our country who are so uneasy at that thought that they become so nativist and xenophobic and start taking their anger out at immigrants. And that's actually what we're seeing right now around the country. And I think we need to promote a vision of solidarity with people around the world, you know, who have a shared interest in fighting for a more equitable world, a more sustainable world. And I think we're, I think people are more advanced now. Like people will get it, once we start to sort of promote that vision. And then I think we need to continue to call for an end to endless wars because, like James said, like we really need to do some soul searching and think about what our priorities should be. Let's look at the long neglected crises at home. Like why are we number one in COVID-19 deaths and number one in prison populations, number one in mass shootings?
Right.
Maybe that's related to the fact that we are also number one in nuclear weapons, overseas bases, defense spending, right?
Right.
So I think we need to redouble our call for cutting the military budget, addressing human needs. And then, as you said, specifically in the case of Korea, we are calling for three main things. One is a peace agreement to end the Korean War. That's fundamental for resolving the conflict with Korea. 2, lift Trump's 2017 ban on traveling to North Korea, because that will allow families to reunite, that will allow humanitarian relief workers to do their jobs, that will allow people-to-people exchanges. And then the last thing is end the US-ROK combined military exercises so that we can preserve space for peace talks.
Got it. That's all really good. And then just one quick follow-up for you, Hyun, specifically the hashtag Stop Asian Hate. I mean, obviously in the US, we've had such a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. It's unbelievable. So, I guess kind of open floor for you to comment on that. But I guess what I'm thinking is how much of this is Donald Trump's rhetoric and right-wing crazy rhetoric, and how much of it is long-standing policy of just anti-China, anti-North Korea sentiments? I mean, obviously there's no correct answer, the balance between those two things, but can you speak a little bit to that? And maybe—
Can I jump in there too after Ms. Lee's done?
Of course, James, yes. But yeah, Hyun, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, anti-Asian violence is nothing new. I used to work at an organization called Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence, where we documented cases of anti-Asian violence, of police brutality. It's not new, but it has, taken more center stage, let's say, in recent months. And a lot of it is driven by rhetoric from up top, right? And I think it's bipartisan. Of course, it was started by Trump, but it's not just Trump. It's not just Trump's party, right? There's bipartisan consensus in Washington that China is the new enemy, right? And a lot of that, I think, influences how people think and act in our communities. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And yeah, James, go ahead.
Well, I mean, it was excellent behavior to shoot Chinese. We cleaned the Chinese up. Every Clint Eastwood and John Wayne movie, the character should go to a Chinese hotel and a Chinese grocery store and be served by a Chinese. The Chinese were all over the West after they built the railroads, and we shot them. We pushed them into the sea. Read the evidence. I mean, it's nothing new. I've written about it in 2 of my books. When Joe McCarthy needs a issue in 1950, what does he do? He holds up a sheaf of papers and he says, these guys talk to Mao Zedong and they're in the State Department and we got to fire them. And he starts McCarthyism with an anti-China. This is an old rail in American history. So it didn't start with a recent politician. It's in the American DNA, I'm sorry to say. And there's a long history of it, and it should stop. We should wake up. We should push the big blank screen across. We should not let the people who told us there was WMD and this other baloney and Russian bounties. And I mean, the lies are unbelievable. We should not let them focus us about Asia. Asia is our friend. Let's be a friend.
Awesome. I love it. I love it. I have a couple questions from the audience, and then we'll talk to Madison real quick. First question would be for you, Hyun. What would be the implications of formally ending the Korean War? What does that actually mean? If pen to paper, what does it mean?
Yeah. I mean, in the most basic sense, it means an agreement to replace the armistice system that's in place right now, where all parties are always in a state of readiness to quote unquote fight tonight in military terms, right? So that means constant military training, constant realignment of bases that displace people and pollute the environment. That means increased defense spending on both sides of the DMZ and also the US, right? So it means ending that system, replacing with a permanent peace system where all parties agree to start to draw down their arms. And at the most basic level, it would take the threat of nuclear escalation off the table. Right now, I think it's a very dangerous situation because, you know, both sides are in a state of armistice, which is a temporary ceasefire. So the bar for resumption of war is very low. War can happen at any time on the Korean Peninsula. And now we have two parties that are nuclear armed. You have 28,000 US troops who are completely exposed because North Korea now has advanced missiles that can hit, US bases in Korea, in Guam, in Okinawa. And the last missile test that North Korea conducted, the South Korean military even admitted that they were not able to track it with their missile defense system. So, they're completely exposed. And I think even for the safety of, US troops in South Korea, it makes sense for us to end that war.
Excellent. Excellent. I see your sign there, Linda. It's great. We have another question. We'll go to you for this, James, but Hyun, you might want to add to this as well. This is from James. How do we overturn power? How do we best fight the power of the military-industrial complex? And I know, James, you've referred several times to it's about us and what we do here. Is that the same thing for the military-industrial complex?
I would get Norman Solomon on the program, and I would, after I read his fabulous book, War Made Easy. And I'd leave it to a smart person rather than ask me.
Oh, I understand.
No, James is so great. I've loved listening this evening.
Oh, that was Norman right there. Yeah. No, Norman is brilliant, and I love working with him. It's great. Hyun, do you have thoughts on that and pushing back against the military-industrial complex?
Yeah, I mean, I think people on this call probably have lots more knowledge and expertise on this issue. You've been at it for much longer. I think, the call for defunding the military or cutting the military budget, I feel like that's grown recently. We didn't really used to hear that 10 or 20 years ago. I feel like now, even just, my neighbors on the block will just easily talk about that. Like, we need to cut the military spending, so I feel like, civil society, framing of the issue, talking about it, taking control of that narrative. I think that's super important. And it's even a discussion in Congress now. So, which it didn't used to be. So I think that's really, really important. I remember ages ago reading Seymour Melman's book. Do you know? I don't remember the title, but about, moving from a war economy to a peace economy. I would highly encourage everybody to go back and read that, because it actually has laid out a plan for how do we do that, right? What are all the different sectors of forces that need to be involved in that? I think we need a much larger movement involving labor unions and all different sectors, the environmental movement, all different sectors of civil society in the United States, to really have a serious conversation about how do we move from a war economy to a peace economy. I think that's important.
That's good. Hyun, could you do me a favor and put the title of that book or the author in the chat for us so we could find that? That's great. I wanted to ask Madison. Madison Tang is here from Code Pink. Madison, I'm going to ask to unmute you. You let me know when you are unmuted. Oh, there you are. And maybe we can see you. Spotlight video. There you are. I wanted to follow up on that question with you, if that's okay, and then I'll let you pitch what Code Pink is doing. So Code Pink is an anti-war organization, and you are the head of the China is not our enemy campaign. So I guess if you have any thoughts on this, fighting the military-industrial complex, what can we do? What's the best thing we can do? Yeah, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ryan. Thanks to James and Hyun Lee. So honored to be among this company, and thanks for everyone for joining us.
I'm so sorry for putting you on the spot like that too.
Well, here, can I be the bad guy and ask you some questions?
Sure. I'll try my best.
Okay, so I'm Mr. Military, and I'm on MSNBC, and we're talking about the freedom of Taiwan. We're talking serious. We'll have peace later, but we're going to fight. We're going to send the American Navy out and use all our strength to make sure that that Taiwan it becomes independent of China. And we got to do it, and it's moral. And let's go. Let's start a war. I mean, what's your objection to that? I think that's the argument, right?
Well, Taiwan and Hong Kong have very different political and cultural kind of experiences and histories than mainland China. But I think it's important to note that in the US's national security and defense planning, they actually acknowledge and highlight the key geostrategic vulnerabilities of China. And Taiwan is one of them. You can probably guess the others, and you can kind of think about why we're talking about those areas. There's North Korea is named as one of them because of the border, the South China Sea, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet. So when we think of it that way, what we're really seeing is, like, over the past several years, a concerted attempt by the US to balkanize China by kind of creating disruption, delegitimizing, or in other terms, like spreading liberalism in all of those regions, just like attempts at balkanizing the Soviet Union. So when you look at it that way, the US's investment in democracy or freedom or a certain way of government is more about kind of containing or disrupting China's rise to power than about spreading actual human rights or freedom.
Gotcha. And I guess
exactly, this is a smart woman. Wow, you got it. That's the most succinct. That's brilliant, and that's where it's at. It's moving the marbles around China. It's a containment.
That's right. And I guess, Madison, real quick then, and then we'll go to Code Pink's campaign, is to the military-industrial complex. I guess, what would you tell the activists to do? What should we be doing?
So Code Pink actually has a whole campaign to defund the Pentagon. I can quickly find the link to that. And you can follow that campaign. There are petitions and actions. Here's the link.
Thank you. And then could you talk to us a little bit about the China is not our enemy campaign and what you're doing with that?
Of course, yeah. So I'm the coordinator for Code Pink's China is not our enemy campaign, which I can also link in the chat. And it's been a little over a year. This campaign has been co-founded by our Code Pink co-founder, Jody Evans. And the goal is really our co-founder, Jody Evans, was seeing, of course, these parallels between the war in Iraq and the justifications to manufacture public consent for war. The same issue of like atrocity propaganda, weaponizing human rights allegations, down to like WMDs are being used, and like numbers like even in Kuwait, the numbers surrounding like 315 babies being thrown out of incubators, a similar thing where we have 100 million Uyghur Muslims with this number is not really evidence-backed, but keeps getting repeated. So we saw that happening, and the goal for our campaign is really to just challenge and dismantle this kind of unilateral anti-China narrative being led by the US and its allies and NATO, and to basically to disrupt this provocation and escalation into war against China. And our coalition has extended now to include other communities in the Pacific, just like was being talked about tonight so brilliantly. So we have a volunteer team actually that meets bi-weekly. And if anyone's interested, feel free to reach out to ask more. Anyone is welcome to those bi-weekly meetings. We also have a news listserv just for those internal members. And we work on strategy, content creation. We're trying to create more shareables to get the popular education going. That's our main goal, is to just, especially education for the left. As was kind of mentioned in the chat, like progressives in the left are really being used by this anti-China narrative. And it's tapping into like some deep-seated biases, because Orientalism in the United States really goes back to mercantilism in 1492, when European colonizers met the Orient and met China, created the ideology of the Orient. Those biases are deep-seated in the US. So a lot of progressives aren't questioning enough this idea of China being the aggressor, China being this huge threat to the US. And like was stated today, the goal is really to maintain US supremacy for US global supremacy for the US. But it's not being framed that way. It's being framed as an arms race. So yeah, if you want to get involved, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we do webinars pretty regularly. You can view them on our site. We have a couple petitions. One of them is to stop the new US Marine base being built in Henoko, Okinawa, against the will of the indigenous Luchuans there. One of them is at Secretary Blinken to ask him to stop the aggression against China, stop anti-Asian hate both abroad and at home, because we see these as intertwined. And yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to ask in the chat. Otherwise, I'll let you all move on.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated, Madison. We have a wealth of knowledge on this call tonight. Hyun, real quick to you. What are the organizations you're working with and your main campaigns? Our call's running late, so I got to move to the action, but real quick.
Yeah, 3 things like I mentioned before: end the Korean War. There's a House resolution led by Representative Ro Khanna that will be introduced soon, not yet, but soon, calling for a formal end to the Korean War. So that's the first thing. The second thing is a campaign to tell the State Department to lift the travel ban. And then the third thing is end the US military exercises, and more information will follow on those specific campaigns and how people can get involved. But you can follow, I put the link to our websites in the chat, and you can follow our campaign work there.
Thank you so much. James, do you have anything to anything to pitch for us?
I just say good luck to all my friends. You know, the American Navy should take care of Chesapeake Bay, New York Bay, San Francisco, Seattle. China can take care of Hong Kong, South China Sea. Gee, there's a word in the middle of the South China Sea. It's China. It's funny.
That's funny. All right. Thank you all so much. Feel free to stick around and hang out and talk in the chat or answer some questions. We'll be here for another 10 minutes or so. But now I'm going to be posting to the chat our action for tonight. So it says action, and then there's the link. So click there, and I'm going to share my screen so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Let's hope I click the right button. Hey, that looks like I did. So we're doing a couple things this evening. Okay, everyone can still see that. So we have 2 actions you can take for emailing your reps and senators. The first one is from Roots Action. This is our action. I encourage you to take it. And this is about supporting cutting military spending by at least 10%. Super easy.